So, hello, folks. Thank you very much for joining the Schusterian Careers podcast today. We rebranded recently to be more in line with our mission focused on boot campers, self-taught engineers, and career changers really looking to build their way into the technology field. And speaking of which, I have on the call with me today Nick Strawn, who has probably one of the most inspiring stories I have heard about technology. I mean, really is something that you should sit down and figure out how to really write it up and tell it, because it is very storybook-esque at this point. So, Nick, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Brian.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So, so talk to me a little bit about your early career before technology. You joined it. Yeah, I know. I met you after you've already joined a boot camp. You've already been involved, but you had a very interesting run up to that. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think I started out like a lot of people, kind of actually predating what I'm kind of known for. I was, fast food, right? And I kind of worked my way up from there, got into logistics in my mid-20s, I suppose, and became a truck driver. Me and my wife were drivers together. So 12 hours I'm driving, she's asleep. 12 hours she's driving, I'm asleep. And so the truck never stopped rolling for about 5 years.
Wow.
And so, yeah, we did that together. Learned a lot, met a lot of people, went a lot of places. It was a lot of fun. But we eventually got on for a company, and one of our routes was for Tesla. And we would take parts here from the Southeast and take them out to Silicon Valley to some of their warehouses out there, and kind of really got to see the technology sort of as it was coming up, as they were testing it, sort of got a back, got to see the background, right? See what was going on behind the scenes.
You got to see behind the curtain.
Yeah, exactly. And it was kind of right there and then that I was like, look, tech is coming. Not just for truckers, but, for a lot of industries. And it's something that I need to pay more attention to. And as I was truck driving, I used to listen probably for about 6 to 8 hours a day. Great course lectures, actually. And a lot of that was based around philosophy, psychology, things like that. Well, I started listening to more about tech and sort of, was thinking about it and didn't really know where to go. But one thing that did stick out to me was sort of, the cybersecurity aspect of that, the cybersecurity aspect of having a logistics industry that depends on automation. And yeah,
actually, I am curious, especially as somebody who was totally non-technical, but you started getting into that. Can you tell me what you studied and really what resonated with you as somebody who knew no technology, as someone was there? Like, what were you listening to? What did you talk about? Like, what were those early days like?
Yeah, a lot of those topics weren't even really around tech, but it had to do with it, right? So I read a lot about complexity theory. Parts of that were like emergence. I read a lot about different aspects of complexity theory, whether that be game theory, things like that. And as I was kind of studying that type of stuff, right, thinking about complex systems and the interactions between them and the properties that come from those, that's sort of where somewhere in there is where tech came along, right? The idea that it was this really complex system that we'd built. And so, especially thinking about like the internet and what connects us all and things like that. So those concepts sort of built from there, I would say, actually. Psychology as well, right? That was a big one that influenced me in terms of, that's sort of the underlying system of all systems that we've ever built as a species. So like that was something that definitely interested me. And kind of that was the early building blocks of what kind of built me up to leading into tech, believe it or not, was non-tech things, you would think. But
interesting. So
yeah.
So all right. So you had a choice of what you could go into. The obvious one being like AI, robotics, self-driving cars, and things of that nature.
Right.
But you said that you got interested in cybersecurity. So
I did.
What was the thing that made you want to go in that direction in particular, given the wide world of everything you could have done?
Right. I think it's sort of that big brother aspect of me, right? Like it's sort of that protector version of me where
Mm.
I want to sort of be a part of that perimeter. I want to protect what's most important.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that tech is important. It's so important that we really have kind of gone all in on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in terms of the way our civilization's being built, the way that we're moving forward into the future, it needs to be defended. And that was sort of the thing that stuck out to me. It was sort of looking at where we were going and realizing that there was a huge deficit, there was a huge need for protection of those vital systems. And that's sort of what really made me think about cybersecurity in particular, of all aspects of tech. And it also, something else I really liked about it, it seemed to not just put me into one specific area,
Mm-hmm.
it allowed me to protect all of it. So I could find myself in these niche areas of tech defending it. And I might actually find something else that I really enjoy, right? And within tech, as I move around, right? So right now I'm kind of part of that fintech, but yeah.
Right, right. Interesting. So, actually, I want to go back to something else because I'm noticing an interesting trend here. So,
Mhm.
when you said you studied great courses and you did philosophy, psychology, how many courses did you take roughly as you were driving?
Throughout the years, I probably listened to, I know the hours, the
Yeah.
listening hours were over 6,000 hours of various different topics, ranging from psychology to everything. Honestly, I studied a lot about redefining reality through using scientific methods. I listened to a lot of that type of stuff, a lot of lectures.
You listened to 6,000 hours of
Yeah,
lectures okay. Because
yeah,
there's an interesting idea because I've been reading Range by David
range.
Epstein, which
Yeah,
is all about this and how, like, as we look at people and their IQs and how they're going, how we're changing, is that strong generalists are finding are really important for this day and age because as super
yep,
systems keep changing, technologies keep evolving. You know, something like metaverse coming in today, and it's like, well, how in the
yes,
hell is that going to change things? You
yeah,
know, as it starts entering the tech debate, these underlying foundations here. What I'm noticing about the way you're talking about these things is that you're talking with a really broad range of topics or whatever. I mean, that's a very well reasoned approach of why you get into cybersecurity. And for me, talking to, I mean, now hundreds of students about this, usually it's, more narrow than that. It's something that's easy to
no,
learn. There's
yeah,
good jobs. It's there. You almost have this systematic approach that's almost based on it, which is why I wanted to ask about the courses, because it sounds like you have a lot of structures you're going on, and you just happen to choose something that goes in the right direction. It's excessively well reasoned for for what it was. So 6,000 hours of learning is
yeah.
basically okay. Wow.
Yeah, I knew I had a deficit. I didn't graduate high school. I knew coming into my 20s, I honestly found myself in a truck, and I figured out a way to sort of educate myself in that process.
Wow.
But yeah, to your point, I would say that is true. I do like the operations
Mm-hmm.
of. I like to look at, as a trucker, you get this real good sense of being the data packet for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
right? You realize that you're transferring resources and goods between server to server or city to city,
Right.
right? And then it's dispersed into these smaller network packets like a box truck. And then for me, it comes from, you begin to realize that honestly, it's all a network and a system.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the things that I'm really interested in, is the complexity concept, the concept of all these little technologies and how they all kind of synchronize together to create the overall experience, right? You talk about meta and stuff. I actually have my Oculus right over here, or what was the Oculus.
Yeah.
And but like I really enjoy all these aspects of tech, and I think a lot of people find that one piece that they really like. Whereas for me, I really do like the connections between all of them, the sort of the logistics of it
Right.
all,
That's
really.
that's really fascinating. I could go into that because I got my
Yeah.
Quest and VR and my whole spiel here because now it's like, I want to get into what makes a metaverse app different versus what are the on ramps into that industry. But we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
What I do want to get into then is, okay, so you chose cybersecurity. You had a well-reasoned approach there. How did you get involved with Vanderbilt and that
Yeah.
side? Because for reference, he graduated from the Vanderbilt cybersecurity program, and
Thank
it
you.
seemed like you could have gone anywhere, especially since you're so. Where was home at this point? You were everywhere, but
Uh,
where was home?
yeah. So Nashville is where I stayed,
Nashville.
but I was looking at options, right? And like you said, I kind of had a lot of options. Um, I looked at a lot of options in my area. I was actually going to go for a 4-year degree in computer science. Didn't really know about boot camps, really. Didn't know that
Interesting.
they existed at that time. I just was like, well, I need to go to college for computer science, so that's what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had enrolled, and I was going through that process when a Google ad came up because it knew that I was interested from my searches, and I saw the Vanderbilt boot camp, and I was like, "That's interesting. I'm going to read about boot camps." And I've heard both sides, right? Like, oh, this was really good for me. This was really bad for me.
Yeah.
I knew that it was a bit of a gamble
Mm.
based off what I was reading, and as somebody who especially somebody who hadn't been to college and dropped out of high school, it was a gamble, right? Like I could read all the lectures in the world, but could I do the work? And, so I went into it and not with the highest of expectations for myself, to be quite honest with you, but I gave it everything I had, and I did really well at it. It paid off, but essentially there was a lot of decision making in that time, right?
Yeah.
And things like that.
Take me through that decision making process. It was a gamble. So what were the risks? What were the payoffs
Right.
to you? How did that compare to a 4-year degree versus self-teaching? Take me through that process.
Right. So I could have gone through self teaching. The struggle I knew that I was going to have there was the direction. I didn't know exactly what to study at what points to quickly understand enough to get into somewhere, right? I could have spent another year learning a lot of things that weren't necessary for the job role.
Mm-hmm.
If, without that sort of mentorship and that structured hand there to guide me. And I learned that a lot from my great courses lectures, right? Like I have a very deep, profound respect for education. And I sort of was like, okay, I want an education. So there was another part of it, which was, do I want to do a boot camp or do I want to go to college? And to me, that the college at the time seemed like the better payoff. It seemed like I would get a degree, I would have a deep foundational knowledge in tech, and then the boot camp seemed like the risk. It seemed like, well, this is very quick, it's very fast paced, it's probably more for people who already have a technical background, which I don't, right? And it could pay off really well for them. I don't know that it would for me. It might be too quick.
Mm.
And I kind of thought about it, but one thing that just kept hitting me was, Nick, you're 30 years old, there's this opportunity, why not take a chance, right? Save up some money, pay for this, and go do it, and see if in 6 months you can make a turnaround on it, right? And get your money back. Just see if you can get in there, learn the material, and flip it, right? And so that's sort of the payoff that I had in my head, and I was like, okay, I would rather spend 6 months, get straight into an industry, then worry about college, than spend 4 years attempting to get into an industry and then getting into a job. So
Right.
to me, it was I figured that the 6 months was a better opportunity for me personally.
Interesting. Okay, so you did that. You found the boot camp. You decided on cybersecurity. So talk to me a little bit about the cybersecurity boot camp experience, but specifically about like what were the challenges you experienced and how did you really overcome those?
Yeah, a lot of the challenges I had were sort of self-confidence, I would say, was a huge one. I came in just totally, feeling like, oh, I don't know enough here, right? Like I went through those same mental processes I think everybody does when they go into a boot camp, especially if they're from a non-technical background, right? I was kind of like, oh man, like I don't know about scripting and all this kind of stuff. That was one of the biggest challenges. The other challenge I think was when I went in, there wasn't a such thing as COVID, but you know,
Oh,
three,
yeah.
but then a month in, that's when COVID hit and I lost my job. So then there was a lot of insecurity and sort of like, can I make this 6 months, right? So then the pressure kind of dialed up a lot. It was
Wow.
like, okay, I needed this to pay off in 6 months. Now I really need this to pay off
Okay,
in six
how did
months.
you manage that stress?
I don't know. I focused, the boot camp actually was tough enough that it distracted me, right? From like a
Interesting.
lot of stuff. It really gave me something to sink my teeth into and sort of keep my mind off of, everything. But luckily I had my wife and she was still driving trucks.
Mm.
So she kind of held it down for me during 6 months. So I owe it a lot to her to help me on managing my stress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. We talk about stress and stress management, but one of the things I noticed, especially because that's the thing, in life, we deal with lots of little stresses. Like, that's the thing. Like, the first few months after COVID, that's real stress. That's rare that we get. We get more common stress where it's more uncertainty about the future right now, right? Where
Right.
it's like, what is this new bill that got passed going to do to the economy? Is it going to really help things? Is it going to hurt? How is inflation? It's almost like that light tension you can't really do anything about, but is always kind of present.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing. You can get burned out on that versus real pain I found where it's like do or die. And I
Yeah.
experienced this when I joined the incubator and I really there. It's like it was intense, 16-hour days every day. And it's
Right.
kind of like I don't know how the hell I dealt with it, but it's just like my body went up and like, okay, we've been preparing for this. Go.
Yeah.
And doing
Basically.
that. And I'm glad you brought up your spouse because like, people ask, I get asked, I'm now at the point where like between the kids, my engineering manager job, and starting, Schusterian careers and doing events and helping people,
Yeah.
people are looking at me like going, how the hell can you do it? And I'm like, it's the
Right.
wife.
The wife.
She supports
Yeah.
so much about what I do and how that happens that if I didn't have her, like, it just so much of this just wouldn't be possible.
Absolutely.
At least not as I have it now. I wouldn't have a happy family. I don't think I would be as balanced as I am. So
Right.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more of on the technical side of what I found difficult
Mhm.
or what I was afraid of when I went into the boot camp was like actually part of me got into cybersecurity because I was trying to avoid programming. Right.
Oh,
I yeah.
well, you should. Well,
I got into it thinking I'm not smart enough to be a programmer, right? But I can learn permissions and things, right? So I get into cybersecurity and it's like, oh, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to learn a scripting language. And I'm like, okay, here we go. This is not what I expected.
what
But
was the scripting language?
the first one was Bash,
Mm,
and then we kind of moved on to PowerShell and a little bit of Python.
right.
And but with the Bash, I definitely I was like I kind of knew this going in, and I just studied for it and showed up about a month or two in, and I was one of the strongest at Bash, and a lot of that. And I always say this is because I played Magic the Gathering for a long time. Yeah, and it helped. It helped a lot.
So you placed
And
a mental model over it that you knew, that
yeah,
understood, and it helped ease the transition. Now that's okay. Oh man. Take me through that. Take me through that. What was that mental modeling and mapping you did that helped that transition? Because that's
yeah,
fascinating.
absolutely. Yeah. So in competitive Magic the Gathering, at least, there's a lot of variables that you have to think of. You have a 60 card deck, right?
Hmm.
And you can think of this deck as a program. It's got 60 lines of code, right? And essentially, you build this thing to be highly efficient. You think of like probability. Do I want 4 of this card or only 1 of this card in the deck? So you're thinking about your draw ratios. You're thinking about all these aspects. You're thinking about what you might encounter on the table, all these different things. But one of the things that really helped, was the mental mapping of the stack, the concept of the stack. And so everybody's heard of Stack Overflow, things like that. First in, last out. And instead of a queue design. So I sort of learned that. I learned like, oh, okay, when I'm kind of writing a script, right, and I'm writing a line into it, and then it sort of goes on to this next line that's kind of like cards in a deck. And I can sort of go ahead and choose how I want that to pop off or how I want that to trigger based on what I'm doing in here. And so I learned how to like stack those triggered abilities or commands and kind of thought of it that way, kind of a lot like a Magic the Gathering deck. And yeah, that's sort of the mental mapping I did with that. But
That's incredible.
Magic kind of gave me a way to visualize that. And I think a lot of it too, it wasn't just Magic actually. I think it was me doing exactly what I was kind of taught, or what I was learning in the truck was learning systems and the similarities between them.
Right.
And that's sort of what it really comes down to, is sort of like game theory and applying these sort of concepts to other concepts, because a lot of it's honestly borrowed from one another. So
I mean, honestly, you seem like a poster child for the kind of world that David Epstein was talking about in Range. I just keep hearing that concept because he basically the idea is that like most deep experts kind of assume the strategy and apply a tactic to it, right? They work within it. And within a domain that works incredibly well, within a narrow domain that works incredibly well. But when you're in a uncertain domain, like you were when you first started the boot camp, it was don't assume the strategy, find the strategy that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then once you find a strategy to map, even if it doesn't seem to make any damn sense on the surface to anyone, saying, how did Magic the Gathering do that? That's fascinating. How did that work? And it makes sense. But once you find a mapping that works, then you start to apply the tactic after the fact there. I mean, kind of that modeling. And I have to assume that the 6,000 hours you spent studying all the different mental models that exist in the world had to have helped you come up with that.
It did.
What sounds like a war chest of techniques, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or mental models.
Yeah, I owe it to a lot to professors that I've never met. Right, like I really do. They gave me a lot of profound concepts, and they definitely helped in those lectures. They do an amazing job. Like I can't recommend it enough. But yeah, there's this one that really sticks out. It's called Redefining Reality. I can't remember the professor's name exactly. I'm sorry, but it's it's with the great courses.
Right.
It's an excellent read. And it really helps sort of when it talks about redefining reality, it starts from the smallest systems and sort of builds its way up into what is one of the most complex systems, right? And sort of how all that integrates, how it all works, and it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
it really is.
That actually reminds me of probably the greatest computer science book I've ever read. It's given to me by a brilliant computer scientist. I mean, he basically is a guy who his job was building compilers. His dream job was to build compilers in Linux. I mean, this guy was brilliant. Yeah. And basically what code did was it built up the concept of what is a message, and literally takes you from a wire that electricity goes through all the way to an operating system, a full-blown operating system, and builds point by point by point by point. I studied that book like a textbook for 6 months, and it was extraordinary when you can see the system actually built up and do that. And again, there are almost like steps that you go through where it's like, this is now a different category of thing, but it's simply made up of an underlying assumption. So that's incredible that existed at your level too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Sorry.
No, take your time.
There we go. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like one of the most profound things that I sort of was looking into is kind of similar to what you're talking about. Is right. The idea that like an H2O molecule on its own isn't wet. You put a lot of them together and an emergent property occurs. Which is that it's wet. It's a concept of wetness. Now, but the H2O molecules they don't really understand that, right? So I think in a lot of ways, artificial intelligence and things like that is the emergent property of us. And I think that that's sort of what we're building to. or what we're building. It's kind of like the blood cells that create us or the skin cells that create us. They're not aware of our existence. We're aware of theirs. But I think eventually there will come a time where possibly artificial intelligence and everything robotics and sort of where that is going will sort of be an emergent property of us. It'll be that next step and sort of an evolutionary path.
Oh man,
From a very broad perspective.
There's a very interesting discussion here, and I think especially since you're interested in philosophy in this, I think we get
yeah.
Okay, let me take us back to the original subject because I don't have the time to dive into this because this is fascinating.
Yeah.
So all right, so you're kind of in this boot camp. You had this wonderful set of mental models, and you kind of go through that. When did you realize you'd make it?
Oh man. I would say probably, honestly, maybe about halfway through.
Halfway through?
That's about when I was like, okay, I'm 50% done. I've done well through it so far. I feel like if I can keep this up, if I can keep this momentum up, even if things get tougher and I don't know that I can complete it, I might finish around 80%, right? And be like, hey, but instead it worked out. But yeah, I would say about halfway through is when I felt that feeling of I can do the rest.
Right. So you had that feeling. Then when did the next phase of it? So you had the boot camp experience, you had the learning, you had that feeling of I can do this. When did the next step of, all right, education, now I need to get into the industry? What was that transition like?
That was me falling back onto the skills that I already kind of had. It was relying on those soft skills to network and meet people and sort of reaching out and being like, hey, I'm interested, I'm passionate, I want a career in this. Like, what can I learn from you? What can I teach you? What can we do to help one another, in whatever way possible?
What methodologies were you using primarily to do that? The network, because here's the thing, we call soft skills that because they kind of talk about intangibles, but there are like fundamentals that fall into that there and be able to do that. I have my own. What were the ones you used there? What were the nuts and bolts of your networking strategy?
The nuts and bolts, if I go down to the core concepts, it goes back to an old psychology book and it comes back to complexity theory, and that is probability. It is increasing probable odds that something can emerge. And so I think a lot about if I engage with this person and that person and that person and that person, I'm X amount more likely to have a result that I, want, a tangible result that I would like to have. And they are as well. So it's sort of about trying to increase those probable odds as much as possible. So engage in your communities, engage with people, teach what you can, help where you can. And sometimes something might be, might come back your way that you weren't expecting. You might think it's luck, but it wasn't. It was from something you did maybe a year ago. You don't know, right? I had a football coach who 10 years later, I hadn't spoke to him, saw I was in cybersecurity, and he knew people for me to talk to. So it's about increasing those probable odds.
Yeah, it's funny, like, and one of the concepts that I'm a big fan of Anti-Fragile. It's on my top 8 book list, basically. That's what this is behind here. It's blurred out, but that's what's always sitting behind me. And this idea of there's like ancient like traditions that we're sitting with, religion and different spiritual, stuff there that like we don't realize are there because they taught something. There was some lesson there we don't quite understand. And one of them that gets brought up because one of my mentees, Isra, basically at IBM, always says basically that good karma is going to come your way, basically. And this idea of karma, and what you're describing is a very materialistic way of describing, or very physical. This way of describing karma. And actually, there's something you mentioned there, which is the mentorship and the tutoring, which you put into the strategy of doing that. So let me see if I pull that as
okay.
Did you see mentorship and teaching? Again, not fully, because again, there's other reasons why one would mentor and teach, but did you see that as connected to your networking strategy? Or
Absolutely.
Was that just the same? Absolutely. Okay.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer that human beings, whether we like it or not, are constantly social engineering, right? That we like to say like social engineering is a technique we use in cybersecurity for penetration testing purposes. I don't think that's true. I think everybody social engineers constantly for various different reasons, for instance. So likability. You want people to like you. You want to help people. People want to help you. Like, this is social engineering. So yeah, exactly. To me, that was more of the theory that output, right? If I continue to if I continue to create output on whatever my system is, the more likely something is to ping, right? The more likely something is to be receptive of what it is that I'm doing. And so I'm increasing my output. I'm increasing that probability. I'm increasing those odds that there's something that I would like to go and do, or whatever the case is. So yeah, in a lot of ways, it all does boil down to that aspect of generating emergent properties by creating output.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because that's the thing. Like, because we know, like, I guess we have to tell people in a very narrow sense. Teaching helps others, right? And we have to sell them on those things. But you seem to foundationally get that helps the whole system, and even have a better way. Because I didn't even have that. I mean, you taught me there something, or at least, or a way to connect the pieces there, which is that, because I know mentoring helps, but it's almost because I recognize it over time. The more I give, the more I tend to get back, which is great. That's what they teach in kind of an anti-fragile.
Right.
I don't have to understand shit about the underlying system.
Yeah.
I just know that works, and I've had enough tests in enough environments to know that that happens there. But you seem to understand why that might be the case, or at least have your hands on the underlying fundamentals. So that's a fascinating strategy, and it works too, because like, as I'm going through this idea of holding a summit and a course for people in cloud computing, Web3. I want to do metaverse at some point. Like, I think there's all these things, but at its foundation, that basically when you go and give to a community, what you don't understand is that you're putting yourself in a prime position to be seen as a leader within that community, to go and bring people in to do that.
Yeah.
It's what I'm trying to, in part because of this podcast. I love doing this and I love having that.
Yeah.
But in part, I get to help people, but it also puts me in this really great position. You being on this podcast get to do the exact same thing.
Exactly.
Now, okay, so, all right, so we talk about probability, there, and you expand your probability. Okay, I'm going to try to ask a smarter question. What was the activity you think that contributed the most to you going from boot camp without a position to you now have a position in a company? What was the activity you think that kind of generated the most energy in that direction?
It's direct networking.
Direct networking.
Handshaking, right? Smiling, not just messaging, but actually direct contact of some sort, whether that be through a camera, kind of like we are now, directly showcasing weakness. I believe in like at first when I was on LinkedIn, I sort of started posting my homework, whether it was correct or not, I didn't care. It was output, right? And so that's what it all draws down to, right? Is output. It all comes to output. So to me, that was directly what got me from boot camp to job, was just the insistent. So one big thing I've recommended to a lot of my students: write it on your windows. I just graduated a boot camp. I would like a job for X, right? Post it. All the output you can generate into your entire system, do it. Take every platform that exists and use it. Discord, LinkedIn, I don't care, Facebook, go back to friends that you haven't spoken to in years, generate output in whatever way you can.
I mean, I gotta say, Nick, I'm kind of getting overwhelmed here, because there's something about the technology field that these days has gotten very elitist. Is kind of the way I see it, and the way that operate there, particularly with, I think it's the West Coast influence is a lot of that in a lot of the way there. And even developers I know that live in that area here, like, kind of talk that way, right? Where there's a lot of language checking in the area. I got to say, I've met a lot of people like you, but you probably embody the blue collar developer more than I think anyone I've ever met before, in the way that you operate, in the way that you do there. And that's the thing, that is, like, I see people who do that, but most people try to get into the elitist mentality at some point there, that they do that.
No. To me, it's a waste of bandwidth, right? That's something else, is that it's the concept of mental bandwidth. It's the concept of, like, if I'm sitting here focusing on how I'm being perceived, right, then I'm reducing bandwidth on what I can actually output, because I sort of have this input kind of coming in, Right. Like it's sort of like public speaking. If I'm speaking to a group of people, but I'm constantly thinking about what that crowd is thinking about as I'm trying to do output, it doesn't work. It doesn't mesh well. So, like, to me, it's all about trying to control mental bandwidth. That was a concept that was taught to me a lot throughout my lectures, was controlling one's thoughts, and sort of not directly controlling the thoughts necessarily. Like, sometimes you can't help but think what you think, but it's being aware of when you're not operating at your fullest. And for me, if I walked around and tried to blend into this tech field in a way that was like, well, I speak differently or I behave differently. No, there are aspects about me that, I feel like the bandwidth is not necessary. The focus on fixing those things would be a waste of my time, whereas I could invest it more into labbing, or I could invest it more into understanding a new technology instead. So I kind of don't focus on those things as much. Now, sometimes that could be a problem, right? Perceptions are important, right? But I agree. I think that the blue collar aspect of kind of what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's an emergent kind of thing. It's
Yeah.
something that is there, and I don't think it's going to go away until it does, I guess. But I'm not trying to root it out, so to
Right,
speak.
right. But it's interesting there. You're right. Perceptions are important, but it's also because again, a perception is something you're signaling that you're part of a particular community at at that time. Now
Yep.
that's the thing. If you come in and like again, if you like I said, you go into like a technology company today and call it West Coast there, and you try to wear a suit or something like that, you stick out like a sore thumb. So
Right.
again, there's something about perception, but I think what you're doing is you're signaling that you're not part of that group. That's a different thing. What you're saying is that this group's culture or something about it is not me. I am over here. We're over. I'm not saying you're doing that, but
Yeah.
to me, that's this idea of it's something that's really rooted down in reality. It's
Mhm.
really truly about the work, and it's about the people too, right? It's more
Yeah.
populist in nature as opposed to exclusionary there. And
Right.
it's funny. There's a number of developers I've met over my career. I can think of now three examples off the top of my head that kind of you fit into the category. Like the boss who hired me into IBM, the only person who actually said your business background, my non-traditional background, and my technology could be very powerful.
Mhm.
Actually started off, he was actually a musician in California for like
You're
8
right.
years. Decided one day, I'm going to be an engineer. Went off, got an associate's degree because he didn't have a degree. Became a developer, got a job at IBM. He recently just left to be a senior Linux administrator at SpaceX. And he
Yeah, that's
complete
amazing.
it's a,
That's amazing.
right, and he did that, and he's sort of thing. Another guy, I just learned this. So recently, I met a internal founder at IBM who's now building a suite of products for the Watson Group. Basically, he's an internal founder. He built a product. He came to my leadership group, like my boss and my peers, to go and explain how does AI work, how does it operate, how do you build a team. And he
Yeah.
just when he left, the whole room was buzzing. Where it's like this dude understands. He understands design thinking. Does it? He's brilliant. And so funny. I met this guy and I'm like, hey, I'm going to introduce him to one of my self-taught engineers because he's an AI guy. He's great. He's brilliant there. And so I introduce one person as a self-taught engineer, the person I was introducing, and Ryan just as this brilliant guy. And then Ryan replies back and says, actually, funny, I'm a self-taught engineer without a degree. I spent 6 years in retail and I worked in there. And I stop and I go, you're like the smartest AI developer I've met in this
Right.
whole group. Are you effing kidding me? Like I think I think I F-bombed him on the reply because I'm like, are you serious? And it turns out that's the case. So there's almost like I'm almost finding this pattern, and particularly with the world we're moving into where like the boundaries are getting real fuzzy all of a sudden because it's like we're moving into
Mhm.
this new era, and it's very clear that whatever boundaries we have, and we're starting to find tension. The city state mentality is starting to
Yeah.
break down. What is technology versus what's human, and what's the intermix? Like there's
Yep.
so many areas where it's like people with range just dominate in those fields, and they're starting.
It's
Yeah, please.
I think it comes down to adaptability.
Yeah.
I think that when you look at somebody who spent a significant period of time doing one thing and then completely switches it to go and do something else, right? Maybe they aren't as fine tuned into the specific, niche area that like somebody who who really spent all that time into this one place, right? Maybe they don't, but what they do have, or what they have accomplished, right, is the ability to master two things or get close to mastering two things. The
Right.
ability to sort of, it's that range, it's that switch, that idea that like, well, they're adaptive, which is a
Right.
quality in and of itself, right? The ability to pivot, the ability to have something completely fresh and new, pick it up very quickly, enough to like actually get the job done, and then they can pivot and switch and do something
Right.
else as well.
Rapid competency is really it.
Yes,
That's the
yes,
thing there, because their expertise, and it's funny because we think of the expertise field as being very as being a safer bet, but the truth is that there's a lot of hidden risks there in
right.
that direction. I mean, I'm having discussions with some of my engineers about the technologies they chose, and some of them are deep experts in technologies that just don't matter anymore, you know? And that's the
Right.
thing that's there.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because it's like, this is, you are clearly the best at this thing you're talking about, without a doubt. It's not your technical ability within that field. It's the fact that that field's going away, you know?
Yep.
In that direction. So like there's some fields like we like to look at almost like a survivorship bias, where we look at fields like, well, if you're a Linux administrator in the 80s for some reason, or the
Right.
90s, and you stayed there, that's thing. Therefore, the strategy is you should become a deep expert in your thing. But the truth is, there are people who are deep experts in technologies and languages that owned the world a decade ago that
Right.
barely matter today. It's
Yeah.
like, what the hell are those people going to do?
Yeah. And I think it really it comes back down to that mental bandwidth concept,
Mhm.
right? Like where you've put your eggs in your basket. If you spent 10 years mastering something, that's fantastic. You're probably the best at that area and you've carved something out for yourself. But yet, like you're saying, if it comes up that this is no longer relevant, now you're 10 years in the hole. That 10 years is all of a sudden 10 years of something that is no longer relevant. And the guy who spent 5 years pivoting, the last 5 years pivoting to something new, might actually now be ahead of you, just like that.
I
And
mean,
so that's something to kind of keep in mind, right?
yeah, and I think you're exemplifying that quite well. You know what you're doing, because
Thank you.
I met you, and now you were started off. You got your cybersecurity certification. You went into a cybersecurity job, but then now you're in a DevOps role, right?
Yeah, yeah. Things switched very quickly. I'm actually no longer in that. I'm doing like SSO and AD sync implementations for my company,
Wow.
setting those up and doing monitoring on servers and looking at virtual scale sets and
Wow.
things like that in Azure. So I'm sort of now in that area, right? And I'm happy. Like to me, I can easily get bored. And my boss knows that. He knows that like if Nick learns something and he gets it down, he gets bored and he wants to go do something else. And so that was what he told me. That was a big, huge reason on why he hired me for the role that I'm in, is because I'm adaptive and I'm quick, and he wants somebody who's willing to just dive into something they do not understand and learn it and master it and then move on to something else. So, and I'm more than happy to do that for
Wonderful.
him. Yeah.
Wow, that's a very cool skill set to be able to do. I have no doubt you'll be able to figure out how to work that as well. You know, particularly because now,
Yeah.
okay, so that's the thing. An hour was not enough time.
So,
As I'm realizing, I'm definitely going to have a follow up with you, or a live stream or something, because I want to just dive into these little hidey holes we just keep uncovering. But I want to try to
right.
stay somewhat on brand. So, okay, so talk to me a little bit about your community you're working on, and how you started there, how it was useful, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so a lot of it, I've tried to be active in communities in general. Ever since getting out of the boot camp, I highly suggest anyone finding one. Um, Me and my boss, actually, my CISO, he's one of the teachers at one of the boot camps and also teaches around the United States. We both also teach at Nashville Software School. And so we decided to start our own nonprofit organization
Wow.
called Hello World. And we're actually building the website right now. We're looking into sponsors, and we're trying to make a pretty all-inclusive Discord channel that essentially will have labs, giveaways, career advice, mentorship, just ways to learn, right? And so sort of building that, it's that emergent property, right? Create change if there isn't any present. So that's what we're trying to do, right? So you continue just pushing that and pushing that as much as possible. So that's something that we're sort of working on the back scenes right now, and should be ready to go here very soon.
I'm very excited about that. I'll make sure to post anything you have in the show notes related to that.
Thank you.
To talk about this. Well, that's the thing, Nick. I know we kept it to an hour. Definitely not enough time. Wow. I think I could go for another hour. So yeah, no, you're already invited back at some point, either
Awesome.
for a recording or a live stream or just an event there, because I think your story in particular is very interesting on how you're able to jump and just continue to apply models to what you were doing, to really exemplifying, go through figure out the right strategy first and then go about it, because you're very adaptable. Before we stop, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, but thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. It's always a pleasure, dude.
This has been an absolute blast. And yes, I will be joining this Discord group as well. So I'll be promoting it and being a part of it. So I'm sure I'll even be a sponsor at some point of this, just because I love the networking and getting people involved, and that side of it. So it's been wonderful. So, all right, Nick, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.